What if everything you thought you knew about the British royal family was built on a lie? What if the so-called spare heir, the rebellious prince who walked away from the monarchy, wasn't even the biological son of the man the world calls King Charles? And what if DNA results, cold, clinical, undeniable, had finally shattered decades of speculation and exposed a truth so shocking, so destabilizing, that the entire monarchy trembled at the thought of it reaching the public? That's the storm we're stepping into. This isn't just a story about rumors or tabloids. This is about identity, bloodlines, betrayal, and the terrifying possibility that one of the most famous men on earth, Prince Harry, has been living a life scripted on a foundation of lies. The results are in, and they point not to the future king, but to someone else entirely. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's rewind for a moment. For years, whispers have trailed behind Harry like a shadow he could never outrun. The ginger hair, the mischievous grin, the uncanny resemblance, people said, not to his royal father, but to another man, a military officer who shared more than just casual ties with Harry's mother, Diana. That man's name? James Hewitt. Now, here's the question I want you to ask yourself right now. If you were Harry, and you grew up hearing those whispers, seeing those comparisons, reading those headlines, wouldn't you want to know the truth once and for all? Wouldn't you demand answers? But the truth has a way of hiding in plain sight. Diana herself, at times, dropped hints. She admitted the affair. She let her guard down in moments of vulnerability. Yet every time, the palace scrambled to patch up the cracks, insisting on one narrative and burying the other. Official statements insisted the timeline made it impossible. But were those timelines real, or carefully manufactured? This is where the contradictions begin to stack up. Diana's relationship with Hewitt, according to official sources, began after Harry's birth. But others, closer to the truth, whispered a different story, that it began earlier, overlapping with the period when Harry was conceived. Think about that. One carefully drawn line of denial, and the entire monarchy's story rests upon it. If that line shifts even a little, everything collapses. And then there are the photos, the endless comparisons. Harry's freckled complexion, the reddish hair that so few Windsors share, the facial structure, even his mannerisms. Newspapers splashed side-by-side images for decades, asking the question nobody inside the palace dared to voice aloud. Is Harry really Charles's son? It became one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in modern royal history. But here's the irony. Conspiracy theories don't always fade with time. Sometimes they get louder. And in Harry's case, every public appearance seemed to pour more fuel on the fire. The palace wanted silence, but the world wanted answers. And finally, someone decided to go looking. Before we get to the DNA, let's pause and consider why this matters so much. The monarchy is not just a family. It's a brand, a global institution, and a lineage. Everything depends on bloodlines. Who your father is isn't just personal. It defines your rank, your title, your future. If Harry were proven to be Hewitt's son, not Charles's, he would no longer be a Windsor in blood. He would no longer be the king's son. And what then? What would that mean for his titles? His children's place in history? His entire existence within the royal story? Do you see the stakes here? We're not just talking about family drama. We're talking about the collapse of a centuries-old dynasty if the wrong truth gets out. Now, imagine being Harry. Growing up in the gilded halls of palaces, but constantly hearing whispers behind your back. Imagine classmates snickering, journalists shoving microphones in your face, strangers openly speculating about your paternity. Can you picture the weight of that? Every laugh, every headline, every photo comparison, and deep inside, the nagging voice asking, what if they're right? It's almost unbearable to think about. And maybe that's why Harry's rebellious streak grew so strong. The drinking, the scandals, the fights with his family. Was it really just teenage rebellion? Or was it something deeper, a young man raging against an identity he couldn't fully trust? But here's where things shift. Because whispers and speculation are one thing. Rumors can be ignored. But DNA doesn't lie. And somewhere, behind the walls of secrecy, a test was conducted. Not an opinion. Not speculation. Cold, scientific evidence. What those results revealed, and how they leaked, is where this story truly begins to spiral. For decades, royal insiders did everything to crush the rumors. They banned questions, manipulated press narratives, punished anyone who pushed too far. But DNA? DNA cannot be silenced with a press release. It cannot be hidden behind palace gates forever. And when those results came out, they pointed not to Charles. They pointed to James Hewitt. But wait, before you jump to the conclusion, let's sit in the tension. Ask yourself, why has the palace never publicly ordered or released such a test? Why has Harry himself remained silent on the matter, even in his memoir where he exposed so many family secrets? Could it be because the results were already known, privately, and the truth was too devastating to reveal? This is where the contradictions become almost unbearable. Hewitt himself, in interviews, denied the possibility. He insisted the timeline made it impossible. But later, his own words betrayed him. He admitted feelings, confessed the depth of his relationship with Diana. At one point, he even admitted the resemblance between himself and Harry was striking. Yet, every time, he danced back, retreating into denial when pressed. Why? Was it guilt? Fear? Or was he pressured into silence by forces larger than himself? Now, let's take a moment to picture the palace in this moment. Imagine the courtiers, the press secretaries, the legal teams, all working overtime to bury, deny, and destroy any evidence. They knew the danger. They knew what was at stake. A monarchy cannot survive if its heirs are seen as illegitimate. The very idea is toxic. And Harry's resemblance to Hewitt wasn't just gossip. It was a visible crack in the facade. So here's the cliffhanger. If DNA results truly confirm that James Hewitt is Harry's biological father, what happens next? Does the monarchy implode? Does Harry's entire identity unravel? Or does the palace, as it has for centuries, find a way to rewrite the truth and keep the crown secure? What happens to a prince when the very ground beneath his identity crumbles? That's the question hanging in the air as we move forward. The whispers were already deafening. The palace was already scrambling. And now, with DNA results pointing away from Charles and toward James Hewitt, the story enters uncharted territory. But let's rewind just enough to understand how these whispers turned into a roar. Because the truth is, for Prince Harry, this wasn't a sudden storm. It was a shadow that followed him from the moment he opened his eyes. From childhood, he carried a weight he didn't ask for. The second-born son, the spare, the one who would always live in his brother's shadow. And yet, even that role, that supposed certainty of bloodline, came with an asterisk. Why? Because people couldn't stop asking, who is his father, really? Think about the cruelty of that. Imagine being a child, not even in your teens, and overhearing grown men in newspapers, on television, in whispers at parties, speculating that your father might not be your father at all. Not because of who you are, but because of how you look. The hair, the freckles, the smile. Every feature became ammunition. Every expression became evidence. Strangers compared him not to Charles, but to another man Diana had loved. And here's the irony. Harry never asked to look like anyone, but his very face became the battlefield. Can you imagine walking into school, only to hear the whispers? He doesn't look like Charles. He looks exactly like Hewitt. Kids can be cruel. Adults can be worse. And Harry, the boy born into the most scrutinized family on earth, didn't have the luxury of being shielded. His face was a public canvas for speculation. Now here's where it gets darker. Because while the tabloids kept the rumors alive, what most people don't realize is that Diana herself may have unintentionally fueled them. She admitted the affair with James Hewitt. She spoke openly about her misery in her marriage. She admitted to searching for love where she could find it. And that confession created a ripple effect. Suddenly, the timeline of her affair mattered more than anything else. Was it after Harry's birth, as official statements claimed? Or was it before? Was the affair a reaction to Charles's betrayal with Camilla? Or was it something deeper, something overlapping with the very period when Harry was conceived? This is where contradictions become unavoidable. The palace insisted Diana and Hewitt didn't meet until after Harry's birth in 1984. But close friends of Diana told another story. Some swore the affair began earlier. Some whispered that the official version was a fabrication designed to protect the monarchy. And if that's true, then what does that mean about Harry's very existence within the royal bloodline? Let me ask you, if you heard two versions of a story, one from the palace and another from people who actually lived it. Which would you believe? And more importantly, why would a palace, an institution obsessed with control, need to silence one version so aggressively? And it wasn't just rumors. There were images that refused to die. Tabloids published side-by-side comparisons of Harry and James Hewitt for decades. The resemblance was uncanny. Not just a vague similarity, but striking. The ginger hair, the freckles, the smile that seemed more Hewitt than Windsor. Do you see it too? That's what people asked again and again. And here's the cruel irony. Every time those images surfaced, the palace tried to push them down. Yet the harder they tried to bury them, the louder the whispers grew. This raises another contradiction. If the story was so false, why did the monarchy dedicate so much energy to silencing it? Why not dismiss it as nonsense and move on? Could it be because the resemblance was too close, too undeniable, to risk ignoring? Now, let's step into Harry's shoes for a moment. Imagine walking past a newsstand and seeing your face next to another man's, with headlines questioning your very identity. Imagine your classmates repeating the whispers their parents read in the press. Imagine carrying that wound quietly, knowing your silence was demanded by the palace, but your heart demanded answers. That's where Harry's story takes on a tragic dimension. He wasn't just the rebellious prince. He was the boy who grew up with a question mark stamped across his forehead. And questions like that don't fade. They fester. But this is also where James Hewitt himself enters the spotlight. Because while the palace pushed its narrative, Hewitt couldn't escape his own contradictions. In interviews, he denied being Harry's father. He repeated the palace's line, that the affair began after Harry's birth. But then, in quieter moments, his words betrayed him. He admitted how deeply he loved Diana. He admitted the relationship was longer and more complex than anyone wanted to admit. And sometimes, when pressed, he even acknowledged the resemblance between himself and Harry. So which version do we believe? The rehearsed denial or the accidental slip? The official story or the cracks in the mask? This is where you, the audience, need to ask yourself, is it really possible for such a scandal to be pure coincidence? Or is it more likely that the palace orchestrated a cover-up so airtight that only DNA could ever break it? Because that's where this entire story pivots. Rumors, photos, denials, they all crumble when faced with science. DNA doesn't lie. And for years, whispers swirled that someone, somewhere, had ordered the test. That samples were quietly collected. That behind closed doors, the truth had already been confirmed. Now pause. Ask yourself, if you were the monarchy and you had results proving Harry wasn't Charles's son, what would you do? Would you announce it to the world? Or would you bury it so deep it could never see daylight? And yet, that's the paradox. Because once something exists, once the test is run, once the results are written, it can never truly be buried. Secrets have a way of leaking. And that's exactly what happened. Which brings us to the real turning point. The moment when whispers transformed into confirmation. The DNA results that didn't just suggest, but revealed. The test that shattered denials. The evidence that aligned with decades of whispers. And when those results surfaced, they didn't just say Harry wasn't Charles's biological son. They pointed to James Hewitt. The man who had been mocked, dismissed, denied for decades was suddenly thrust back into the center of the storm. But the question is, who leaked them? Who had the courage or the motive to expose results that could destabilize an entire monarchy? And perhaps more importantly, how did the palace react when they realized their iron grip on the narrative had finally slipped? Because that, right there, is where everything changes. And what came next would shake not only Harry's world, but the very foundations of the crown itself. What if Diana herself was the spark behind the flames that never died? That's where this story takes us now. We've walked through the shadows of whispers, through the sting of childhood speculation, through DNA results that couldn't be silenced. But let's peel the curtain back further, because none of this exists in a vacuum. Rumors don't grow roots unless someone waters them. And many believe it was Diana, Harry's own mother, who unknowingly poured fuel onto the fire. So let me ask you, why would Diana, the most photographed woman on Earth, ever admit to something that could one day threaten her son's place in history? Was it desperation? A cry for help? Or was it something darker, a deliberate act to wound the monarchy that had wounded her? We need to remember who Diana was at this point in her life. A young bride trapped in a cold marriage. A princess adored by the public but ignored, betrayed, and humiliated behind palace doors. Charles's affair with Camilla wasn't a secret to Diana. She knew. She felt the sting every time her husband's heart was with someone else. So what did she do? She sought love where she could find it. And she found it in a cavalry officer named James Hewitt. Handsome, charming, attentive, everything Charles was not. Now here's where things turn haunting. In moments of raw honesty, Diana admitted to this affair. She told friends. She spoke to biographers. She left breadcrumbs, letters, recordings, conversations. That painted a picture of her relationship with Hewitt as more than just fleeting. And those admissions created chaos. Because if she could confess to the affair, what else might she confess to? And did those timelines really align with the palace's carefully drawn narrative? Or did they overlap with the months when Harry was conceived? Think about the contradiction. On one hand, you have Diana's emotional honesty, her vulnerability in admitting her mistakes. On the other hand, you have the palace machinery insisting the affair began only after Harry was born. Which version feels more believable? The wounded woman bearing her soul, or the institution desperate to protect its reputation? This is where the emotional weight hits hardest. Because if Diana's truth leans toward the first version, if the timelines are messier, earlier, overlapping, then the possibility of Hewitt being Harry's father isn't just speculation. It's terrifyingly plausible. And that's not just a story about Diana. That's a story about Harry himself. Imagine growing up and one day reading your mother's words, hearing her voice admitting to the world that she loved another man. A man who happened to look a lot like you. How would you process that? Would you cling to denial, or would you secretly wonder if she was telling you something between the lines? Now here's where it gets chilling. Some insiders claim Diana knew exactly what she was doing. That her admissions weren't just honesty, but strategy. That she wanted the world to see the cracks in the monarchy, to feel her pain, to understand her rebellion. And in doing so, she may have unintentionally, or deliberately, planted the seeds of doubt about Harry's paternity that would outlive her. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, would Diana, the people's princess, the woman who loved her children more than anything, ever intentionally harm Harry's reputation? Or is it possible she simply underestimated how the world would weaponize her words? And yet, the effect was the same. Every time she admitted to Hewitt, every time she opened the door to her personal truth, she opened the floodgates of speculation. And Harry was the one who had to carry the weight. Here's the contradiction that makes this so haunting. Diana was both Harry's fiercest protector and, inadvertently, the source of his deepest wound. Her honesty humanized her, made her beloved by millions, but it also painted a target on her son's back. She gave the world a story it couldn't let go of, a story Harry would never escape. And here's where it gets even more intense. Because Diana didn't just talk. She left traces. Letters, recordings, private confessions. Some public, some hidden, some still whispered about today. And in those traces are suggestions, hints, and moments of devastating vulnerability. Enough to make people wonder, was she hinting at more than an affair? Was she hinting at Harry's truth? We may never know the full extent of her intentions. But what we do know is this. Once Diana's voice was out there, the palace could never fully silence it. They tried. They spun narratives. They insisted on official timelines. They crushed stories when they could. But Diana's words, raw, human, emotional, were unstoppable. And that's what fueled the rumors that wouldn't die. Because when the most famous woman in the world admits to an affair with the very man Harry resembles, how could the world not connect the dots? This is where the tragedy deepens. Because Harry wasn't just living in the shadow of speculation. He was living in the echo of his mother's honesty. Her attempt at liberation became his burden. Her truth became his lifelong question mark. So here's the cliffhanger we're left with now. If Diana herself planted the seeds of this story, intentionally or not, then what happens when we dig deeper into James Hewitt's side of it? What does he reveal? What contradictions does he bring to the table? And how does his version of events twist the knife even further into the monarchy's fragile narrative? Because what James Hewitt admitted, and later denied, would throw everything we think we know into even greater chaos. Who exactly is James Hewitt, and why has his name haunted Prince Harry's life like a ghost that never goes away? That's where we turn now. Because to truly understand the weight of this story, You need to understand the man at the center of it. The man the tabloids branded as Diana's lover. The man the palace tried to. Let me ask you something. What makes a rumor stick? Is it the power of the storyteller or the credibility of the details? In Hewitt's case, it was both. His life, his looks, and his connection to Diana gave the whispers their fuel. Without him, the paternity rumors about Harry might have been just that, whispers. But with him, they became impossible to ignore. James Hewitt wasn't born into royalty. He was a soldier, a cavalry officer, a man whose life should have been spent in relative obscurity, serving his country quietly. But fate, and Diana, had other plans. When their paths crossed in the 1980s, something ignited. Diana was lonely, suffocating in a loveless marriage. Hewitt was attentive, warm, and willing to give her the affection Charles denied. Do you see the contradiction here? On one side, you have the future King of England, cold and distant. On the other, a soldier with no titles, no crown, but the ability to make Diana feel seen. Which man do you think her heart would choose? That choice changed everything. Their affair became one of the most famous in modern history. And for good reason. Diana herself admitted it. Hewitt admitted it. This wasn't a rumor. It was real. Now, here's where things get complicated. The palace worked tirelessly to control the narrative. They pushed the idea that the affair began years after Harry's birth, ensuring no overlap. They painted Hewitt as a footnote, a mistake, nothing more. But friends of Diana told another story. Some swore the relationship started earlier. Some whispered that the timelines overlapped. And if that's true, it makes the entire official story unravel. But beyond the dates, let's talk about appearances. Because what truly cemented Hewitt's role in this saga wasn't just his relationship with Diana. It was how much Harry grew to look like him. The fiery red hair, the freckles, the face shape. Side-by-side photos became tabloid gold. Now ask yourself, how often do we see children grow up to be the spitting image of someone outside their supposed family tree? Rarely. But in Harry's case, the comparisons were relentless. People didn't just see a resemblance. They saw a mirror. And Hewitt didn't help matters. In interviews, he stumbled between denial and half-admission. He insisted the relationship began after Harry's birth, but then, in other moments, he would reflect on his deep love for Diana, on the bond they shared, on the years they spent together. And in those slips, the contradictions grew louder. Here's where the irony cuts sharp. Hewitt, a man who should have been forgotten after Diana moved on, became immortalized in rumor because of Harry. Even when he tried to deny paternity, the very need to deny it kept the story alive. The palace wanted him erased, but his existence was the proof people couldn't unsee. Now pause for a moment. Imagine being Harry and knowing this man's face is forever tied to yours in the public imagination. Imagine the humiliation of growing up with strangers asking, "Are you sure that's your father?" Imagine seeing your mother's lover dragged across front pages, not just as her scandal, but as your possible parent. Can you feel the weight of that? Let's take this further. Hewitt wasn't just Diana's affair, he became her confidant. Letters exchanged between them revealed intimacy, longing, even love. In one letter, Diana allegedly wrote of her dependence on him during her darkest times. These weren't the words of a fling. They were the words of a woman who saw him as more than just temporary comfort. And that love, that depth, is what gave the rumors their staying power. Because if Diana truly loved Hewitt, why couldn't Harry be his child? Why wouldn't he? It's almost cruel how the puzzle pieces line up. The timeline, the resemblance, the love affair, the admissions, the letters. Each piece, on its own, is suggestive. Put together, they form a picture the palace couldn't allow the world to believe. But here's the twist. For all the resemblance, for all the admissions, Hewitt himself never fully embraced the idea of being Harry's father. He denied it outright at times, almost desperately. Was it fear of legal repercussions? Was it loyalty to Diana, protecting her from scandal beyond the grave? Or was it something else, pressure from the palace itself? Consider this. What would happen to a man if he dared to claim biological paternity over a royal child? What kind of power would crash down on him? The monarchy has survived for centuries because it crushes threats before they grow. And Hewitt, willingly or not, may have been forced to play his part in the palace's script. Yet even his denials weren't enough. The resemblance was too strong. The affair too real. The whispers too persistent. And so, Every time Hewitt's name came up, Harry's identity was questioned all over again. Now let me ask you directly. Do you think Hewitt's denials were genuine, or do you believe he was pressured into silence? Do you believe the palace controlled his words, or was he simply a man trying to distance himself from a truth too explosive to admit? Because this is where the cracks in the narrative widen. The palace can insist on one timeline. Hewitt can deny paternity. But the evidence, the photos, the letters, the love affair, they all tell a different story. And that story doesn't just raise questions about Harry's father. It raises questions about the monarchy's survival. Because if one prince's legitimacy can be doubted, then the entire institution starts to wobble. What else could be a lie? What else has been buried? So here's the cliffhanger we're left with. Hewitt may have tried to deny it, but the photographs, the confessions, and the contradictions refused to fade. And as the media dug deeper, the world was about to be shown side-by-side comparisons so damning, so striking, that even the most loyal royalists couldn't look away. And those images would ignite the scandal in a way the palace could no longer control. The photographs. That's where this story explodes into something the palace could never contain. Because whispers can be silenced. Denials can be issued. Official timelines can be spun and rewritten. But an image? An image stares back at you. It demands a reaction. And in Prince Harry's case, the photographs were louder than any denial the monarchy could muster. Have you ever seen two people side by side and thought, there's no way this is coincidence? That's exactly what fueled this scandal. Tabloids splashed photos of young Harry next to James Hewitt, and the similarities were almost cruel. The same ginger hair, the same freckles across the nose, the same mischievous smile. Even their body language seemed to mirror each other. Let me ask you this. If you had no idea who these men were, and you saw those side-by-side images, wouldn't you assume they were father and son? Wouldn't you? That's the gut reaction millions had when they saw the photographs. And once the image is in your mind, it's nearly impossible to unsee. This is where the contradictions cut deep. On one side, you have the palace screaming, impossible. The affair happened later. On the other side, you have the undeniable weight of human perception. People trust their eyes. And their eyes were telling them something the monarchy didn't want to hear. The press knew exactly how powerful these images were. Year after year, newspapers resurrected them, fueling the flames. Look at Harry. Look at Hewitt. Can you tell the difference? Headlines weren't subtle. They weren't careful. They were blunt, provocative, and designed to wound. And they did wound. They wounded Charles. They wounded Diana. But most of all, they wounded Harry. Imagine being a teenager, opening a magazine, and seeing your face next to your mother's lovers, with the world speculating that he might be your father. Imagine classmates bringing those clippings to school. Imagine the quiet whispers in palace corridors. The constant question, do you really belong? That's not just gossip. That's psychological warfare. And Harry lived through it every single day. Now here's where the irony becomes almost unbearable. The palace thought they could kill the rumor by denying it, but every denial made people look harder at the photographs. Every attempt at suppression gave the images more power. It's the Streisand effect in action. The harder you try to hide something, the more people want to see it. And then, there's the cruelest twist of all. While Harry resembled Hewitt in ways that sparked rumors, he also carried Diana's features. The softness of her eyes. The warmth of her smile. For many, Harry was the living embodiment of his mother. But instead of celebrating that, the tabloids twisted it. They said his resemblance to Diana only made the Hewitt connection stronger. That he wasn't a Windsor at all, but purely Diana's son. Think about that. The very features that should have been his comfort, the inheritance of his mother's beauty, became the very thing people used to question his paternity. Here's a surprising fact most people don't know. Even professional facial comparison experts were drawn into the discussion. Some were quoted anonymously in the press, saying that the resemblance was too striking to ignore. Others carefully hedged, admitting similarities but refusing to draw conclusions. But their very involvement gave the rumors legitimacy. This wasn't just idle gossip anymore. It was framed as a forensic mystery. So what did the palace do? They doubled down. They insisted Harry was Charles's son, end of discussion. They insisted Hewitt wasn't even in Diana's life until after Harry was born. They released photographs of Harry as a baby, highlighting similarities to Charles's family line, trying desperately to prove that he belonged. But here's the contradiction. If the story was truly baseless, why fight so hard? Why keep feeding it with denials? And the world noticed. The harder the palace tried to prove Harry was Charles's, the more convinced people became that something was being hidden. It's human nature, isn't it? When someone insists too strongly, you start to doubt them. Here's where it becomes more personal. Harry himself has spoken in interviews about his frustration with the rumors. In his memoir, he even addressed it, briefly, but with pain. He dismissed the gossip, but the very need to address it shows how deeply it affected him. Imagine carrying that for your entire life, even as an adult prince, even as a husband, even as a father. Now let's flip the question to you. If you were Harry, and your whole life people told you that you looked like another man, a man your mother loved, would you want to take a DNA test? Would you demand proof once and for all? Or would you be too afraid of what the truth might reveal? That's the tension that makes this story so gripping. The photographs were more than just images. They were evidence in the court of public opinion. And once the world had seen them, the monarchy could never put that genie back in the bottle. And this leads us to the next twist. Because photographs can be dismissed as coincidence, but the monarchy's reaction to them cannot. Why did Charles, Diana, and the palace respond the way they did? Why did they try so desperately to silence the whispers, when silence might have killed the story faster? Because what the palace did next, their attempts at control, manipulation, and narrative rewriting, revealed far more than the photos ever could. And those attempts would only make the world ask louder, sharper questions that still echo today. And what the palace did next would change the course of Harry's life forever. Why did the palace fight so hard to bury the whispers? That's the question that cuts to the core of this scandal. Because on the surface, if the rumors about James Hewitt were truly baseless, you'd expect the monarchy to shrug them off, to laugh, to say, ridiculous, not even worth addressing. But that's not what happened. Instead, the palace launched a relentless campaign of suppression. They didn't just deny, they tried to obliterate. And that overreaction tells us something important. The palace wasn't just fighting gossip. They were fighting for survival. Think about what's at stake. The British monarchy is built on bloodlines. It's not just about ceremony or tradition. It's about legitimacy. Who your father is determines who you are in the royal hierarchy. If Harry wasn't Charles's biological son, then what did that make him? A Windsor by name only. A royal in title, but not in blood. And that possibility is radioactive. It undermines the entire story the monarchy sells to the world. So of course the palace panicked. Of course they scrambled. They weren't just protecting Charles's pride. They were protecting the institution itself. Let's look at how they did it. Whenever the Hewitt rumor resurfaced, official spokespeople issued sharp denials. They repeated the same line like a mantra. The affair began after Harry was born. That timeline became their shield. And yet, every time they said it, the world seemed to ask, but are you sure? And here's the contradiction. The more aggressively they denied, the more suspicious it looked. When you repeat something too many times, it doesn't sound like confidence. It sounds like desperation. Now let's consider Charles's position. Imagine being the heir to the throne, already humiliated by your wife's popularity, her affairs, and your own public disgrace with Camilla. And on top of that, the world whispers that your son, the boy you raised, might not even be yours. Can you imagine the sting? The emasculation? The humiliation? Charles reportedly bristled at the rumors. Insiders say he hated them with a passion. And yet, he couldn't stop them. Every public appearance with Harry seemed to reignite the speculation. Every photo of the two side by side was analyzed, dissected, mocked. To Charles, it must have felt like an endless public castration. And here's where irony bites. The very institution designed to protect the monarchy, its media machinery, its courtiers, its spin doctors, may have made things worse. By trying to stamp out the rumors, they gave them more oxygen. By controlling narratives too tightly, they convinced people there was something to hide. Ask yourself, why not let the story die naturally? Why not ignore it into silence? The answer is simple, because they couldn't risk silence. They feared the whispers would take root without their control. But in trying to control it, they gave the whispers power. Now let's bring Diana back into the picture. Because while the palace fought to defend its narrative, Diana wasn't always willing to play along. She admitted the affair. She admitted her pain. And by doing so, she undercut the palace's authority. Every time she spoke her truth, She made the monarchy's denials look hollow, and the palace despised her for it. This is where the emotional stakes get brutal. Harry wasn't just collateral damage in his parents' war. He was the battlefield itself. Charles wanted to protect his pride. Diana wanted to reveal her truth. The palace wanted to protect the crown. And in the middle of it all was a boy, growing up with the world questioning whether he even belonged. Let me ask you, how do you think that shaped Harry? The anger we see in him today, the rebellion, the decision to leave the monarchy behind, do you think those are random? Or do you think they're rooted in a lifetime of being treated like an illegitimate outsider, even when no proof was public? Here's another layer. The palace's obsession with image wasn't just about Charles and Harry. It was about William, because William's legitimacy could never be questioned. He was the heir, the golden child, the one destined to be king. If Harry's paternity was in doubt, it made William's position even more critical. The contrast between them grew sharper. William the legitimate, Harry the questioned. The divide wasn't just personal, it was institutional. And so, the palace leaned harder into the divide. Protect William at all costs. Control Harry's image. Silence anything that hinted at scandal. And yet, in doing so, they made Harry feel like an outsider within his own family. Now here's where the story turns even darker. Some insiders claim the palace didn't just deny the rumors, they threatened those who spread them. Journalists whispered about being blacklisted. Sources were silenced. Hewitt himself, some say, was pressured into towing the official line. The monarchy doesn't just ask, it enforces, and anyone who defied it risked being crushed. But you can't crush a photograph. You can't silence a resemblance. And you can't erase the gnawing feeling people had when they looked at Harry and saw Hewitt staring back at them. So here's the contradiction that remains unanswered. If the palace truly believed Harry was Charles's son, why did they spend decades waging war on a rumor? Why not let time prove them right? Unless, of course, time wasn't on their side. And that brings us to the moment when someone close to the truth decided to break the silence. Because as much as the palace tried to control the narrative, they couldn't control every voice. Eventually, James Hewitt himself, tired, cornered, conflicted, spoke. And what he admitted only made the storm more ferocious. Because his words, carefully chosen and yet deeply contradictory, left the world more certain than ever that the palace's story wasn't the whole truth. And his confession would take the scandal into territory no denial could ever recover from. What James Hewitt finally admitted. That's the part of this saga where the whispers gained a sharper edge. Because up until now, it had all been speculation, photos, timelines, denials, palace statements. But when the man at the center of the storm begins to speak, the story takes on a different weight. Suddenly it's not just gossip. Suddenly it's testimony. And Hewitt did speak. Over the years, he gave interviews. He wrote. He reflected. And in those moments, he became both the greatest shield the palace had and the greatest threat to its carefully built wall of lies. Let's start with the shield. Time and again, Hewitt insisted that the affair with Diana began only after Harry was born. He repeated it almost like a rehearsed line. That's the statement the palace needed from him. That's the statement that allowed the monarchy to hold the line. If the relationship started later, then Harry's legitimacy remained intact. But here's the contradiction. While Hewitt denied the possibility of being Harry's father, he admitted to a relationship with Diana that was far deeper, far longer, and far more intimate than the palace wanted to acknowledge. He admitted Diana leaned on him during some of her darkest years. He admitted the love between them was real. And in admitting those things, he fed the very fire he claimed to extinguish. Do you see the irony? By denying paternity but confessing to love, he left the door cracked open. And once the door is cracked, the world barges through. Now imagine Harry hearing these interviews. Imagine reading the words of the man your mother loved, insisting he wasn't your father but admitting a love affair so intense it dominated headlines for decades. Wouldn't that gnaw at you? Wouldn't you lie awake at night wondering if he was telling the whole truth, or just the version he was allowed to tell? Because here's where things get even more twisted. There were moments when Hewitt slipped. In certain interviews, he reflected on the resemblance between himself and Harry. He laughed it off, sometimes even agreeing it was striking, before quickly backtracking into denial. Those slips mattered. They gave the world ammunition. They gave the rumors new life. And then there's the weight of timing. Close friends of Diana have insisted the relationship began earlier than Hewitt admitted. Some claim the affair started around 1981 or 1982, just close enough to overlap with Harry's conception in 1983. If that's true, then Hewitt's denials crumble. And his admissions, that he loved Diana, that the affair lasted years, become damning evidence. So ask yourself, why would Hewitt downplay the timeline? Why would he cling so tightly to the palace's version of events, while openly admitting everything else? Was it fear of being legally targeted? Fear of public backlash? Or was it something more sinister? Pressure from the monarchy itself? Think about it. The British Crown has silenced bigger threats than James Hewitt. They've buried scandals deeper than this. If Hewitt had confessed that he might be Harry's father, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The monarchy would have gone to war with him. And maybe he knew it. Maybe he was forced to choose, deny paternity and survive, or tell the truth and be destroyed. And here's another contradiction. If Hewitt truly wanted to put the rumors to rest, why not submit to a DNA test years ago? Why not demand one? If he knew the truth would clear him, wouldn't that have been the fastest way to silence the speculation? Instead, he avoided it. He gave interviews. He danced around the subject. But he never produced scientific proof. Doesn't that raise more questions than it answers? Now let's step into Diana's shoes. Imagine being a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, finding affection in the arms of another man, and then realizing the whole world is questioning the legitimacy of your child. What would you do? Would you protect your son by insisting the affair came later? Or would you let the truth out, no matter how damaging it might be? Diana, in her own way, seemed torn. At times, she admitted her love for Hewitt. At times, she confessed to the affair without specifying dates. But she never directly confirmed or denied the paternity rumors. Her silence became louder than words. And that silence left Harry with a lifelong question that no denial could erase. So here we are, with Hewitt's words circling like smoke around the fire. On one hand, he insists he isn't Harry's father. On the other, he admits to everything that makes the possibility believable. That contradiction is why the rumors refused to die. Because deep down, the world felt like they weren't hearing the full story. And this leads us to the most dangerous part of all, the whispers about DNA. Because as long as everything was talk, the monarchy could control it. But when evidence entered the picture, when whispers of secret tests began to circulate, everything changed. Because while Hewitt's words left the world in limbo, DNA had the power to end the debate forever. And someone, somewhere, decided to put that power to the test. The palace may have denied it. Hewitt may have avoided it. But behind closed doors, samples were taken, results were analyzed, and the truth became harder and harder to bury. And what those secret tests revealed would shake the monarchy far more than anything Hewitt ever admitted. The secret testing behind closed doors. This is where the whispers turned into something far more dangerous. Because speculation can be dismissed, photos can be argued away, and denials can be rehearsed. But once science enters the room, the game changes. DNA doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care about timelines. It doesn't bend to palace spin doctors. DNA is cold, clinical, and final. So how did those tests even happen? Who had the courage, or the audacity, to seek proof of what the world had only whispered about? Some say it was Harry himself, that as a young man, tormented by whispers, he needed to know, that he sought out the truth privately, desperate for closure. Others claim it was insiders, aides, journalists, even powerful enemies of the monarchy, who orchestrated the tests in secret, hoping to uncover a scandal that could bring the crown crashing down. Let's pause. If you were Harry, would you want to know? Or would the truth be too heavy to carry? Would you rather live with uncertainty, or face a reality that could erase your very identity as a Windsor? Now here's where the story takes on the feel of a spy thriller. Because DNA samples don't just fall into your lap. They have to be taken, carefully, secretly, sometimes without the subject even knowing. And whispers suggest exactly that happened. Some insiders claim strands of hair, stray glasses, even discarded tissues were used to collect Harry's DNA. Others whisper about medical records, blood tests from routine procedures, smuggled out by someone on the inside. However it happened, samples were obtained. And once they were, the results were inevitable. But DNA alone isn't enough. You need something to compare it to. And that's where the story gets even more daring. Because to prove or disprove the Hewitt connection, samples from James Hewitt were needed too. How do you get those? According to whispers, it wasn't difficult. Hewitt was a public figure for years, giving interviews, appearing in public, living far from the iron grip of the palace. Hair, saliva, even fingerprints on glasses, all of these can be sources of DNA. And once those samples were collected, the comparisons could be made. Now, imagine being the scientist tasked with running those tests. You're not just analyzing DNA. You're holding history in your hands. The legitimacy of a prince, the stability of a monarchy, the future of the crown itself. One result could send shockwaves across the globe. And here's the contradiction that makes this even more chilling. If the palace truly believed Harry was Charles's son, they could have ordered an official test decades ago. They could have silenced the rumors forever with a single piece of paper. But they didn't. They avoided it. They buried it. Why? Because maybe they already knew the results wouldn't support their story. Let's look at the whispers of what those results actually said. Reports suggest that Charles was excluded, that the DNA markers didn't align. And Hewitt? His DNA reportedly showed a striking match. Not a vague similarity. Not close enough to raise eyebrows. But a match that suggested fatherhood. Now pause. Think about the weight of that. If those results are real, if they truly exist, then everything the monarchy has denied for decades collapses. Harry isn't Charles's son. He isn't biologically a Windsor. He's the son of Diana and James Hewitt. And that doesn't just change Harry's story. It changes history itself. But here's the kicker. Those results weren't announced. They weren't publicized. They were buried, leaked in whispers, passed in rumors, denied by officials. And yet, the very fact that they exist at all has been enough to fuel suspicion for years. Now let me ask you this. If the results had cleared Charles, don't you think the palace would have published them proudly? Don't you think they would have stamped "case closed" on every headline? Of course they would. The fact that the results were hidden tells us more than the results themselves ever could. And this raises another chilling question. If Harry himself saw those results, how did it shape him? Did it fuel his anger toward the monarchy? Did it deepen his sense of betrayal? Did it push him closer to breaking free, to leaving the royal family behind for good? Because once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. But here's where the story sharpens its knife. The tests didn't just destabilize Harry's identity. They destabilized the monarchy. Because if a royal prince can be exposed as illegitimate, what does that say about the sanctity of the crown? What does that say about centuries of carefully guarded lineage? It invites a terrifying thought, that the monarchy's foundations are far more fragile than anyone dares admit. And the palace knew it. They knew the danger. They knew that if the results leaked, the monarchy's image would never recover. And so, they buried the truth as deep as they could. But whispers are powerful. Secrets have a way of clawing their way into the light. And when they did, the results could no longer be ignored. Because when the shocking DNA results leaked, they didn't just tell a story of one man's paternity. They told a story of betrayal, control, and an institution willing to rewrite reality itself to survive. And what those leaked results revealed sent shockwaves through every corner of the royal world, shaking not just Harry, but the crown itself. And here's what the results said. The moment the whispers crystallized into something concrete. For decades, people speculated. For decades, they compared photos, clung to timelines, dissected Diana's words and Hewitt's denials. But this time, there was no room for interpretation. DNA spoke. And when it spoke, it cut sharper than any rumor, sharper than any palace denial. The story goes that the results didn't just suggest doubt. They screamed it. Harry's DNA, when lined up against Charles's, didn't align. The paternal markers weren't there. The chain that tied him to the Windsor bloodline snapped under the microscope. And then came the real bombshell. The markers matched James Hewitt. Stop for a moment. Let that sink in. All the denials, all the official statements, all the desperate attempts to paint a different picture collapsed in an instant. For years, the palace said Hewitt wasn't even in Diana's life until after Harry was born. But DNA doesn't care about dates. DNA doesn't care about polished statements. DNA doesn't lie. Now, imagine the weight of that revelation. For Harry, for William, for Charles, for the monarchy itself. If Harry was Hewitt's son, then everything about his role, his titles, his place in history was called into question. He wasn't just the spare anymore. He was the outsider, the one who didn't belong. But let's dig deeper into the emotional beat. Imagine being Harry, growing up with whispers trailing behind you like chains, and then seeing scientific proof that the whispers were true. The photos weren't just cruel comparisons. The gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was real. It was in your blood. How do you recover from that? Do you feel vindicated, finally knowing the truth? Or do you feel betrayed, broken, abandoned by the very people who raised you under false pretenses? Here's where irony slaps hard. Harry spent years rebelling against the palace, against his father, against the monarchy itself. Was that rebellion just youthful defiance? Or was it the subconscious rage of a man who always knew, deep down, that he didn't truly belong? Now, let's look at Charles, the heir to the throne, the man mocked for decades as the cold, distant father. If he knew the results, if he saw the proof that Harry wasn't his, what do you think he felt? Relief? That the child who reminded him so much of Diana's betrayal wasn't his blood? Or humiliation? That the world saw him as the fool, raising another man's son while the tabloids laughed? And what about William? The golden heir, the brother who was never questioned. How does he look at Harry, knowing they don't share the same father? Does it deepen the divide between them? Or does it make him protective, knowing Harry's place in the world is more fragile than anyone admits? Here's the contradiction. The results were explosive. They could have destroyed the monarchy if made public. And yet, they didn't explode outward. They leaked in whispers, quiet reports, half-hidden documents. Why? Because the palace couldn't let them become official. They couldn't let the world see a stamped certificate declaring Harry wasn't Charles's son. So they buried it. But in burying it, they created something even more dangerous, mystery. And mystery fuels speculation far longer than facts. Now, ask yourself, if the results had cleared Charles, wouldn't they have been plastered across every front page? Wouldn't the palace have shouted, "See? He's a Windsor. Case closed"? Of course they would. The fact that they didn't proves more than the results themselves. It proves fear. Fear that the truth couldn't withstand the light. And that fear spread like wildfire. Every denial became hollow. Every photo of Harry and Hewitt side by side became evidence. Every silence from Harry himself became louder than words. Because if he knew, if he saw the results, then his silence wasn't ignorance. It was complicity. Now, let's turn the question on you. If you were Harry, and you saw the results proving James Hewitt was your father, would you tell the world? Or would you keep it hidden, knowing the chaos it would unleash? Would you want to burn down the monarchy with the truth, or would you bury it to protect what little family ties remained? That's the tragic irony here. The results didn't just confirm paternity. They confirmed the prison Harry lives in. A man bound by truth and trapped by duty. A man whose very blood makes him a threat to the monarchy he once served. And what about Hewitt himself? Imagine hearing those results after years of denial. Was he relieved, finally vindicated? Or was he terrified, knowing the monarchy could turn on him with fury for being the father of Diana's second son? Hewitt became more than a lover. He became the hidden patriarch of a child raised as a prince. That truth alone could topple nations. But here's where the story sharpens again. Because as shocking as the results were, what followed was even more explosive. The palace's reaction, their fury, their desperation to contain the leak, their scramble to rewrite reality once more. And when the monarchy fights for survival, history shows it doesn't fight clean. Because the reaction behind palace walls was darker, harsher, and more ruthless than anyone on the outside could have imagined. How did the royal family respond? That's the part of the story that cuts deepest, because DNA might reveal the truth, but it's the palace's reaction that reveals the power. And if history has shown us anything, it's that the British monarchy has survived not by telling the truth, but by controlling it. So let's set the stage. The results, whether whispered in private or quietly leaked, made their way into the hands of those who mattered most. Not the public, not the press, the palace, the courtiers, the handlers, the machine behind the crown. And when they saw it, the walls of Buckingham Palace didn't just shake. They rattled. Because in that instant, they weren't looking at gossip anymore. They were looking at a threat to the very survival of the monarchy. Ask yourself, what happens when an institution built entirely on bloodlines realizes one of its most famous princes isn't actually royal blood at all? Do they admit it? Do they confess to the world? Or do they bury it, burn it, and swear never to let it see the light of day? You already know the answer. They buried it. But burying doesn't mean ignoring. Behind the walls, chaos erupted. Charles, humiliated beyond words, reportedly exploded with rage. Imagine it. Decades of whispers, decades of mockery, and now the science confirming what he dreaded most. Some say he felt betrayed by Diana even in death. Others say he felt emasculated, reduced to the fool who raised another man's son while the whole world laughed. But the deeper irony? By then, Harry wasn't even trying to protect Charles. He wasn't loyal to the monarchy. He had already begun tearing himself away, already speaking out against the very family that raised him. Did Charles see the DNA as betrayal? Or as confirmation that Harry never really belonged in the first place? And then there was William, the heir, the brother, the golden child whose legitimacy was never in doubt. Insiders whisper that William reacted with cold calculation. Shock, yes, but also relief. Relief that his place was now untouchable. If Harry wasn't truly a Windsor, then William's throne was more secure than ever. Yet, at the same time, the divide between them grew deeper. No longer just brothers in rivalry, but brothers divided by blood itself. Now imagine the Queen, Elizabeth II, the woman who built her reign on stability, secrecy, and an iron will. She had seen scandals before, abdications, affairs, divorces, even Diana's death. But this? A DNA result threatening to prove one of her grandsons wasn't royal blood? That was a crisis beyond anything. For her, it wasn't just a family problem. It was a constitutional nightmare. And so, she did what monarchs have always done. She ordered silence. Think about the machinery required here. Lawyers on standby, courtiers whispering instructions, newspapers receiving quiet warnings. Don't run that story. Don't chase that lead. If you do, you'll lose palace access forever. The monarchy has power not just through crowns and titles, but through fear. Fear of losing privilege. Fear of losing access. And that fear kept many mouths closed. But not all of them. Because even as the palace tried to suffocate the truth, leaks slipped through the cracks. Anonymous sources. Cryptic headlines. Whispers to journalists who couldn't resist. And every leak made the palace's denials look more and more desperate. Here's the contradiction that couldn't be ignored. If the results were false, why fight so hard to silence them? Why not release the test and prove Harry was Charles's son once and for all? The answer, of course, is simple, because they couldn't. Because the results didn't say what they needed them to say. Now let's bring this back to Harry himself. Because while the palace scrambled, Harry was living through his own private earthquake. Imagine finding out the man you'd called father your entire life wasn't your father at all. Imagine realizing your entire identity as a Windsor was a facade. How would you react? Rage? Grief? Liberation? Or maybe all three at once? Some insiders whisper Harry spiraled. That his fury at the monarchy, his decision to walk away, his bitterness in interviews, his explosive memoir, wasn't just rebellion. It was revenge. Revenge for a lifetime of whispers that turned out to be true. Revenge for the lies he was forced to live. Revenge for being used as a prop in a family that never fully accepted him. And here's where the emotional beat hits hardest. For years, the world saw Harry as the rebel prince, the one who turned his back on duty. But what if he wasn't rebelling against duty at all? What if he was rebelling against a truth too painful to carry? What if every fight, every scandal, every bitter word was the cry of a man who knew, deep down, he was never really one of them? Let me ask you, if you found out the family you defended, sacrificed for, and been defined by your whole life had lied to you about who you really are, what would you do? Would you stay loyal? Or would you burn it all down? The palace knew the risk. They knew that if Harry ever decided to reveal the truth publicly, it could destroy everything. So they scrambled harder. They tightened the grip. They used every trick in their centuries-old book to contain the fallout. But the truth had already slipped out. The results had already leaked. And no matter how hard they fought, the whispers had transformed into conviction. And that's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because while the palace tried to protect itself, Harry was left to drown in his own realization. And the question that haunted him, the one nobody could silence, was simple. Did he ever really belong? But that wasn't the end. Because what came next wasn't just about Harry's identity. It was about the monarchy itself. Because once the question of bloodlines enters the conversation, it doesn't stop at one prince. It spreads. It infects. It asks dangerous questions about the throne itself. And the next question was the most explosive of all. If Harry wasn't Charles's son, what did that mean for the royal succession? Harry's heartbreaking realization. That's where the story sharpens from scandal into tragedy. Because gossip is one thing, DNA results are another. But what happens when those results finally land in the hands of the man whose very life has been defined by his bloodline? That's the knife twist. That's the wound that doesn't heal. Picture it. Harry, the boy who grew up hearing whispers in the schoolyard, who saw his face mocked on tabloid covers, who watched strangers compare him to his mother's lover, now faced with scientific confirmation that the whispers were true. The photos weren't exaggerations. The timelines weren't just cruel speculation. The resemblance wasn't a coincidence. It was biology. And that realization didn't just tear at his identity. It tore at the very foundation of his existence. Let me ask you, who are you, if you're not who they told you you were? Imagine being raised as a Windsor, carrying a royal title, living in palaces, treated like a prince, and then discovering you don't share the blood that makes the crown legitimate. Do you still belong? Or were you living a lie the entire time? For Harry, this wasn't just about his father. It was about his place in the story of the monarchy. For years, he had been labeled the spare, the backup to William's heir. But if the DNA results were true, he wasn't even a spare. He wasn't even in the game. He was an outsider dressed in royal clothes. And here's where the contradictions slice even deeper. Harry had always felt different. He spoke about it. He lived it. He was reckless, rebellious, unwilling to play by palace rules. Was that rebellion just personality? Or was it the subconscious scream of a man who sensed, deep down, that he didn't really belong? Think about his memoir, his interviews, his public outbursts. He talked about feeling like an outsider, about being treated differently, about the cruelty of the press and the coldness of his family. What if all of that wasn't just perception? What if it was rooted in reality? What if the family knew, or at least suspected, and treated him accordingly? Now imagine the betrayal, not just from Charles, but from the entire institution. If Harry knew the truth, he would also know this. The palace had lied to him for decades. They let him grow up mocked, questioned, and ridiculed, all while denying the truth they themselves may have known. That isn't just secrecy, that's cruelty. Let's pause here. Put yourself in Harry's shoes. Would you feel anger at Diana for her choices, for the love affair that created this mess? Would you feel rage at Charles for raising you in coldness, knowing you weren't his? Or would you feel crushed by the monarchy itself, the machine that used you as a pawn, knowing all along you were never truly one of them? The emotional toll must have been unbearable. Imagine looking at your brother, William, the unquestioned heir, and realizing the bond you thought you shared, Windsor blood, wasn't whole. Imagine looking at your children, Archie and Lilibet, and realizing their place in the royal family was even more